Thank you so much, Jacob. I was told to be concerned about Jacob's introductions, and I'm really relieved. There was a lot that could have been said. So it's lovely to meet everyone. I am Alexa Firmenich, and I'm so honored to be inside of a conference with so many friends, new and old. As Jacob mentioned, I am the founder of Naia Trust. We're a family office investment vehicle with about 30 investments, ranging from market to catalytic to philanthropic, principally focused on nature and biodiversity. And the last 2 years, I've been working with ETH in Zurich, building the world's most comprehensive measure of biodiversity for any location on the planet. Parallel to those roles, I've been on a somewhat non-linear journey, trying to understand and then to try and shift some of the deeper drivers of human culture and behavior when it comes to our broken and estranged relationship with nature. And so those are some of the insights I would love to share with you today, and some frames that have guided my thinking along the journey. Very quickly, by means of background, I was born into a family of businessmen and scientists. I come from a Swiss family company called Firmenich. We make flavors and fragrances, and so we distill the essences of nature into products that touch about 4 billion lives daily. So it's a huge responsibility. And when I was growing up, my father always told me, you know, Alexa, what we sell is the invisible. We sell intangibles. Because when you're selling a fragrance, it's water and it's sort of a fluid in a bottle, let's say. And so from a young age, I was aware of this emotional, intuitive, sensory connection that we have with nature and the living world, and it very much guided my professional and academic career. And I have always tried to bridge these worlds of what you can call the scientific and the poetic. But I also think that these are synonyms of the poetic. You have the sensorial, the invisible, the relational, what Greeks would call gnosis, right? These other ways of knowing and being. And it was very interesting. Across the last decade, I've had conversations with hundreds of practitioners in the space. And the people who are often doing the most intelligent interventions in landscapes and who have a very deep understanding of nature have managed to integrate these different ways of being. And I got so curious about it that, as Jacob mentioned, I started a media channel called Life Worlds, where I interview a lot of people who are working in agriculture, AI, bioacoustics, many different spaces, on how they come to bring these ways of being closer together. This is Juliana Frucci. She's an incredible woman. She's one of Chile's foremost mycologists. She works with the fungi. And she was describing that when she's looking for fungi, she will be pulled in a direction to move in the land, and that is how she's made so many of her discoveries, by this intuitive sense of being guided by the landscape. And Michael Abelman, who's one of the pioneers of the regenerative organic movement and urban street farming, walks through his land with a notebook, and the land tells him what it needs. So this isn't some kind of spiritual, esoteric thing, but there is a conversation that these humans are having with the land that allow them to be a lot more effective in what they do. Another way of thinking about this is what Ian McGilchrist, the British psychiatrist and philosopher, calls the master and the emissary, that we have these two hemispheres of the brain, and for us to function well, they have to be in right relationship with each other. They have complementary but distinct roles. And so the right brain, the right hemisphere, is what he calls the master. It's intuitive, holistic, connected, contextual. Whereas the left hemisphere, and surprise, surprise, I think many of us in this room can understand that this is how Western civilization has skewed, is a lot more mechanistic, analytical, linear, categorical, which again is fine, but it's how they are in relationship with each other that really matters. And what Ian points out, and what many point out, is if we just operate with a left hemisphere frame of mind, we actually have a much more fragmented view of the world. And to sense the whole system, we very much need to bring these ways of being closer together. This is especially important when we think about how we work with nature, because nature is a holistic, living system. And so this sensing aspect of our minds is exactly what's needed, because it maps onto how the planetary ecology actually functions. There has been a revolution over the last years in big data science, machine learning, AI, satellites, ground truthing. And for the first time ever, we're pulling together a quantitative view of the Earth's ecosystems that are allowing us to see dynamics on the ground that we have never perceived before. And I find these things actually so beautiful. This is carbon dioxide. It's the movement of carbon dioxide throughout the year. influenced by many factors, one of which you can think of photosynthesis and the algae blooms in the ocean. But here you can see how the Earth is a living, breathing, dynamic organism. The trees in the air dance with each other. And the hydrological cycles that don't make it into our climate models, barely, we are just starting to understand them. Large forests like the Amazon act as biotic pumps, and they create flying rivers, rivers in the sky, tropospheric rivers, that carry rainfall across continents and affect cooling patterns around the globe. And it's been estimated at certain times of year that you have more water in the sky above the Amazon than actually in the river itself. And I don't know if you can guess what this is. I love this one. This is the migratory movement of species across the planet. These are the birds, reptiles, mammals that move across ecosystems. I very much see them as the blood cells that connect the organs of our body, our Earth body. And these species turbocharge ecological processes, one of which is carbon, but there's many more. And one of my favorite statistics that I discussed with Maria a few weeks ago is the Pacific Northwest migration of the salmon. These salmon swim from high up in the mountains into the deep ocean, and then they return back up the stream, these anadromous species, to die in the same streams that they were born in. And it's been found that about 50% of the nitrogen isotopes in the forests comes from the salmon, because they're died and they're picked up by the bears and the vultures, and so the salmon are feeding the forests, and then there's a whole other cycle where those forests feed the next generation of the fish. And of course, the fungi, who I think are the most apt metaphor for what we're discussing here today, the webs that connect so many of the plants above and below ground. And these guys, they defy our notions of individuality. They defy our notions of life and death. And so we often talk about our relationship with nature. This is how nature does relationships. These are the remarkable relationships that make life possible. And so we are just beginning to grasp the complexity of how the Earth functions as this living, symbiotic entity. And yet, especially in the climate and carbon and biodiversity space, we have very much operated in this way. We've fragmented metrics, we're all touching a part of the elephant, thinking it's what we're actually dealing with. And, for example, the fact that we've separated carbon and nature for so long in our strategies, I think, is proof of this. We've had this slightly dangerous, one could say, carbon tunnel vision. And what happens when you optimize for such a narrow range of metrics is you'll always externalize harm into other systems that you're not accounting for. And it leads to a lot of perverse incentives. And again, I think that we are starting to see this now. One of the examples are the monocultures. 50% of all of the tree restoration campaigns globally have been these fast-growing monoculture plantations. They're not only a lot less resilient to drought and disease, but they actually capture a lot less carbon than a fully functioning ecosystem. And I think it's also worth remembering that when we see a monoculture in the land, it's actually a monoculture in our own minds. Our landscapes are a reflection of who and what we are. And so when we look at these subdivided fields and these dams that are blocking millions of rivers across Europe for no purpose, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean about how we think about ourselves, other human life, and other species? What are these fences and these walls and these barriers? We are about to go through a massive revolution in how we quantify biodiversity. We're speaking about a lot of this in this room, working with the lab, working with my investments. I'm in the thick of this. And the question I ask myself daily is, how do I entertain and keep that holistic perspective while we do the necessary abstraction that is needed to work with nature in our financial systems, insurance systems, so on and so forth? This is a subject of a whole other talk, but there are a lot of risks and challenges ahead. I summarize some of these in this article that you're welcome to read. Social, behavioral, economical considerations when we do this transition. For example, Michael Sandel, who is a Harvard professor, speaks of our value systems and our morals and our ethics. And time again, studies point out that when we replace intrinsic civic values for doing the right thing with market instrumental values, they actually erode the intrinsic values, and sometimes you don't get them back. So this brings up huge questions. Again, it's for a longer conversation. And so, just to summarize where we're up to right now, there are these integrated, interconnected Earth systems. We risk when we abstract them and we don't see the whole. And there's a nature of sensing the world that is so distinct from analytical thinking. And if we cut ourselves off from that intuitive act of perception and knowledge, we're actually not gaining access to a deeper form of wisdom that we need to do the work that is so called of us today. This says 0, but I have timed myself 15 minutes, so I'm going to keep track. I'm a good Swiss. One can say that at the root of the meta-crisis, the poly-crisis, human conflict, is this inability to see that we are connected to the whole and that we are the whole, fundamentally. And so this calls for us to retrain our educational systems, our cultural systems, because at the end of the day, you don't change a system unless you change the consciousness of the actors in that system. So how do we change that consciousness? There's 100 things that we could talk about. I'm just going to give 3 examples that have influenced my life and my work, starting from world, then to community, then to self. So how do we do this as investors, first of all, with Naia Trust? Whether it's our market, catalytic, or philanthropic capital, we always ask ourselves, is nature an equal stakeholder here? Are we viewing nature as the living, symbiotic organism that it is, and that we are a part of, or are we abstracting into resource and commoditization? Are our investments bringing people into closer relationship with the land? Because if we restore land without restoring relationship, that land will not survive. Again, that's been proven time and time again. And finally, we look at a watershed level, or a sort of integrated landscape management. We look at much larger landscapes than individual investments. How does that look in practice? This is all on our website, so I just took some examples. We invest in bioeconomies, food systems, rewilding, bringing humans and nature closer together. We invest in some of that research that you just saw that basically shows the interconnections of life. We fund new models like the rights of nature or ecocide that advance a new paradigm around nature as an equal stakeholder in the global system. And we have just, I'm really excited about this one, completed an 8-month research process on Earth consciousness. This is the first report. We're going to have more every few months coming out. But we've interviewed about 50 to 60 different organizations working on Earth consciousness and how we actually change that much deeper part of us. This was philanthropic, and that's on our website as well if you want to read it. It's now live. As investors, we also bring the system together. So this is sorry, it's in Spanish. This is our work in Mexico. We interview hundreds of stakeholders. We create shared systems maps. We map all the different dynamics. We create collaborative workshops. And then we fund solutions that none of those actors could have done alone. And so again, in a sense, we try and move from this siloed way of being to a much more interconnected system. Community. As Homo sapiens, as very social creatures, we operate a lot better when we learn and practice in embodied experiential ways. So when I was living in Mexico, I started a company called Atlas Unbound, and we were bringing CEOs, investors, politicians into learning journeys deep into the land, where we were talking about deep ecology, regenerative systems thinking, and having this direct experience with the world. I know Felicitas is here, and her company does the same thing. I am a big believer in this model. I think some people in this room have also been to Christiana Figueres' retreats in Plum Village, which is a Zen Buddhist monastery in France. And for me, Tibetan Buddhism has been my core spiritual practice for many years, and I think that it is one of many that also helps to impart a very meditative, interconnected, non-dual, keenly sensitive way of feeling and sensing the world. And finally, self. I think it might sound obvious, but nothing will replace the direct relationship that you can have with the living world yourself. And Robert Bly, in Sibling Society, he speaks of the fact that our world is run by adolescents who haven't had an initiation into adulthood. And in the past, we would architect these initiations into our cultural architecture. And so we would bring people often into direct relationship with the land in things called vision quests or vision fasts. This is a picture I took with a Polaroid camera because I couldn't have technology, I didn't have food, I didn't have a tent, in the desert in New Mexico for several days. And you essentially come to have a very direct experience of the world and how it expresses itself. And for me, this is part of waking up, growing up, and showing up. And this has existed in most of our civilizations for thousands of years. Oh, and by the way, on that last point, if you think that's something very, that doesn't necessarily touch you, I have several friends who hold quite senior positions in climate finance and venture philanthropy who are Vision Quest guides. So there's undercover agents in this room as well, be assured. This is my last slide. I think what's called of us right now is to be bridge builders, especially people who are in this room like us working in positions of leadership. We have to unlearn and relearn all of these new patterns and ways of being. We have to develop the skills and capacities to work with how living systems actually function. And we have to learn how to dance between these different nodes. It creates a very positive feedback loop where you open up to the world, you're broken open, as Lisa so beautifully said earlier, to beauty, to the poetry, to the re-enchantment. And that actually gives you fire to keep going, because this is hard, right? These aren't easy times. And with that enchantment, we're then able to bring more intelligent and strategic interventions into the world and through ourselves. So I love this quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, where he speaks about the sort of motivation that I think is needed versus the more, maybe the more analytical way of operating. So thank you very much.